is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, His hand the wonders.
This is 20 Pages a Week, and I'm your host, Hal Hammons. We are on a journey reading all the way through the Bible this year. Thanks for coming along. This week's reading is Genesis 26 through 50. Joining us for the discussion today are Terry Francis from Chelsea, Alabama, and Zeke Flores from Baytown, Texas. Terry partners with last week's guest host, Philip Martin, on the Do the Work podcast on Facebook. It drops Tuesday mornings at 11 Eastern, 10 Central. I'll say it again, it's worth your time. Thanks for joining me again today, gentlemen. Let's start with first impressions. Genesis 26 through 50.
I'll tell you what strikes me is the people that God selects to be the vehicles of his promise. They're rascals. But I mean, it's actually hopeful for me, because if God can use people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, every one of them had some kind of faith failing, right? But if God can use them to do great, wonderful, big things, maybe he can use me in smaller ways that are maybe just as impactful for not only myself, but especially for my family and people around me. It just amazes me every time I read the Genesis story, how flawed these people were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Terry?
Well, I think kind of kin to that is as I grow older, I realize how glamorized the VBS versions of these stories were when I was growing up. Like when we teach our kids about Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Jacob, we teach them all the good stuff, and we really highlight the good things about them. But then you get older and you start looking into that, and you realize some of those things that we thought were good as 6-year-olds aren't quite as good as we thought when we were 6. I think there's some things, and I tell you what I think is interesting about that. It's like Zeke said, these guys are rascals. I think there's a great term for that. I think we as adults struggle with that. Like when somebody comes and points out to us, hey, Joseph isn't this Pollyannish, good, perfect character that you think he is. We really struggle with that idea because we were raised our whole life to be like Joseph. But when you become an adult, you kind of realize, man, Joseph is not a great role model in a lot of ways. And I may be one of those guys that probably takes the Joseph stuff a little to the edge compared to some other people. But even if you don't go to the edge, there's a lot of things in there that point to Joseph just not being the great guy that we think that he is. And I think that sticks out. And the other thing that sticks out to me, by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, the majority of this section focuses on Joseph, who's not even the guy of promise. Like, that's the funny part. Like, this whole section focuses on a guy, and of course the Egypt story is central to the development of Israelite nation, right? And to the fulfillment of the promises back from Genesis chapter 12. So we understand why that happens. But I think it's pretty interesting just to see that Judah's the guy. We barely talk about Judah at all. He's barely in here. But Judah's the guy that's going to bring about the Messiah, and we focus on Joseph more. And just to kind of wrap that up a little bit, I think it was Saltz in one of his blogs made a point I hadn't thought about before, which is this is a retelling of the story, and sometimes I think we forget that in the retelling of the story, the author can retell it the way he wants to tell it and emphasize things that maybe we don't realize at the time. It's not a historical narrative in the sense that as things are happening, somebody is scribing that down, but rather it's reflective and looking back, and there's some neat stuff that's intentionally done in order to emphasize some of those things. And I think we overlook because we don't realize this is a retelling of what happened with emphasis put on certain parts. And that's, I think, why Joseph becomes such a central theme to this, is later on, looking back, Joseph should be the focus because that's how they wind up in Egypt.
Well, that's I was thinking the same thing, Terry, that so much of the material is given to Joseph, And I think I finally figured out kind of why. It's what you said, it's because he's instrumental in getting them back home, back to Canaan, right? I mean,
Yeah.
before we saw Jacob leave and then come back, I mean, his people are supposed to be planted in Canaan, but then Joseph goes off to Egypt and Jacob follows him again, and they finally get back, which a lot of that maybe gets lost in the minutia of the telling of the story. But there's, we're going to talk about, I'm sure, God's providence, and it's hard to miss that working throughout this whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me say this. It's interesting too that they're told, Abraham's told, go to the land I will show you. And he goes to Canaan and he leaves. And then Isaac goes back to Canaan and then he leaves. And Jacob goes back to Canaan and then he leaves. And now famines play an important role of all that. But it's interesting. It brings up, if Phil's watching, he's going to love this. It brings up kind of the garden ideology that God tells you to do something, and here's this rebellion. God says, hey, go to Canaan. There's a famine. I'm going to go down to Gerar so I can be taken care of where there's water. And even with Jacob, God, I think unlike with Abraham and Isaac, God providentially pulls Jacob to Egypt, by the way, which is really intriguing because there's so much Egypt versus Jehovah conflict throughout the Old Testament. But he pulls him down there. But the other two voluntarily just leave the land of Canaan, even though God said, hey, this is your land. I'm going to give it to you. And they leave. They surrender it, and they go somewhere else. It's really interesting.
Well, you're both only allowed to talk about one story anyway. And we haven't even started the one story section, and you're off on all kinds of tangents. And I'm hoping that Terry's one story is going to be Joseph, because he's kind of got me wondering exactly what was going on with that. So
Is that all 13 chapters, or is that one story of Joseph? What do you want?
Well, this is the second week of the podcast, and you're my second group of guests, so I'm not in position to be lecturing people on how to do things. So however you want to handle it, as long as it's, not 20 minutes long, that'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, so if you start in Genesis 37, and you start from the beginning, I just got to tell you, I'm the youngest of two kids, and everybody knows I'm my parents' favorite. But if I had been a brother to Joseph, I got to be honest, just to use kind of common wording, I'd have punched him in the throat, because he's a little tattletale who likes to brag about how amazing he is, especially in the beginning. And that starts off right away when you're introduced to him. You have this idea that he comes back and he brings a bad report about his brothers from the field. And we see that wording, bad report, and we just think, well, they must have done something bad, and he's, at best tattletaling. But that phraseology, bad report, actually often means that it's deceptive and not true. So there's a good chance, starting in Genesis 37, when we're introduced to Joseph, you got three things right off the bat that could paint his character for you. It's very possible he lies about his brothers in the field when he comes home. Then his dad gives him this coat that says you're special, which he, by the way, wears everywhere. It's kind of like the idea of you got church clothes and you decide to mow the yard in them. I mean, that's what you see. He wears it to the field. He wears it everywhere. And then thirdly, he has these dreams. And I think it's debatable whether or not these dreams are from God for two reasons. He never attributes them to God. And the second dream is never actually fulfilled. His parents never bow down before him. But even if they are from God, the fact is, as soon as he hears them, he has to go brag to his brothers and to his parents, hey, one of these days you're going to bow down before me. And so you're introduced to Joseph. And look, as a 6-year-old in VBS, I never got this. But as a 46-year-old looking at this text and seeing these things from a different perspective, you look at Joseph and you go, man, this is not the brother you want at all.
Harry, do you have teenage children?
I do. I got 3. Yeah. And they've all played the role of Joseph at some part, right? So I've had to deal with that. And by the way, woven into that, Hal, is this pattern of flawed fatherhood throughout Genesis. Oh, yeah. And all the way through, I mean, David shows the same kind of flawed parenthood, right? You think about just this kind of pattern of bad parenting. And, it starts back with Isaac, who chooses Esau over Jacob, even though God said Jacob's going to be the son of promise. The second child here is the one, the supplanter. And yet he chooses Esau. And you see in Jacob the same thing, choosing Joseph. And even in the blessing later on, you see when he brings Ephraim and Manasseh in to bless them before he blesses his own sons, you see a little bit of the same kind of stuff, right? You see this kind of favoritism shown. And even in that, he chooses Ephraim over Manasseh. And Joseph gets upset because Manasseh is the older brother. So you kind of have that pattern throughout the story, but Joseph really highlights that. And so when you understand that introductory kind of section to Joseph, I kind of understand why the brothers threw him in a pit, right? I mean, it doesn't make it right, but I get it, Hey, here's our chance. We can eradicate this problem. And by the way, the section, one of the things to keep in mind, the section where he talks about telling the visions, the language in there, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but reading some of these guys, the language there kind of implies that he told them this repeatedly. Like Joseph is constantly telling his brothers about these visions, constantly reminding them that he is going to be over them one day from these visions. So I just think all of that is fascinating when you dive into it, when you look at it. And there's so much in this story of Joseph. Like I said, there's 13 chapters, and it's hard not to just dive full into all of that. But even in the introductory phase, I think you just get this kind of picture of, hey, here's a guy that his brothers don't like. And the other thing to say about Joseph is this. As a kid, I always was taught that Joseph always made the right choice, and because of that, God was with him, or at least that was what I think was implied. When looking at this as an adult, what I really see is God was with Joseph first, and that often led Joseph to making good choices. But if you see when Joseph is put in Potiphar's house, it says that God was with Joseph. In fact, you see this language, the Lord was with him, a lot in this second half of the book. You see that phrase happen a lot. And so he sold to Potiphar, and the Lord is with him. And because the Lord is with him, then he becomes successful and is put in charge of the house. And then he's put in prison, and that's a whole other story, right? But the Lord was with him, and because the Lord is with him, then he's successful, and he is made higher up in the prison, and he interprets the dreams. And it's interesting that after 2 years of interpreting the butler and the baker's dreams, he's finally remembered. He's taken to Pharaoh, and the Lord is with him. So again, you see this: the Lord is with him, the Lord is with him, the Lord is with him. Because look, even when Joseph goes to Pharaoh, he essentially plays the part of an Egyptian priest and dresses like a priest and marries a priest's daughter and second in command in the kingdom, looks like an Egyptian, all of those things. And so we're taught, based on solely almost this interaction with Potiphar's wife, that Joseph always made good decisions, and yet when we're introducing the family to him, they can't even recognize him because he looks so Egyptian in that sense. So it's just interesting to see that the Lord is with him, the Lord is with him, the Lord is with him. Nobody can hear me?
That's what I'm gathering. Man, that would be a shame.
That would be a shame, because my mic is working. I don't know if I can.
Can we hear?
It's on. Look, I'll tell you, on Zoom on my end, I've got audio occurring when I test it. So
I can hear everyone fine.
Yeah.
One of the things, Terry, you were talking about is Joseph's willingness to talk about himself a lot. Yeah. And I don't know if that's just mouthiness, but we see that about Joseph a lot. He's willing to speak a lot. Sometimes it's good for him. Sometimes it's not so good, but he's always willing to give his advice. He's always willing to say what he thinks. And sometimes it gets him into trouble when he stood up to Potiphar's wife, but when he stood up and spoke to Pharaoh about the things that Pharaoh needed to do, when you get to that part of the story, to me, especially when you get to the part about where he's basically selling all the Egyptians into indentured servitude for a chance to eat. The stuff that he, as a government official, has stored up for them. We see an aspect of self-preservation, I think, in Joseph that pretty much runs all through his life. Now, a lot of it we call godliness, right? What he was doing in the prison, he was interpreting these dreams. He was the best prisoner that he could be, and he was telling the baker and the cupbearer what was going on with them. But what was the reason? Hey, when you get out of here, tell Pharaoh about me, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You're right on. By the way, the shrewdness of Joseph you mentioned with the dealings of the food, right? I mean, by the end of that famine, Pharaoh has everything, right? I mean, when you think about that, he has their cattle, he has their land, he has them as slaves, and they have to give a fifth of everything that they have to Pharaoh. And it says in there that continued on. The shrewdness of Joseph is pretty remarkable. And like you point out, Zeke, self-preservation, I think, is really what drives that bus more than anything else, which God then in turn uses to protect his people.
And that's the thing, is we never know how God's providence is going to work. We hope for the best in the end. And God, that old saying, God works in mysterious ways. Man, he did throughout the whole book of Genesis. There's some weird stuff that happens with some people of questionable character, but God's plan keeps rolling. It keeps advancing.
For the sake of those who are following along live, apparently Zeke and Terry aren't coming through. I think we're getting it recorded with everybody. So if it's not going to go properly live, I apologize for that. I think we'll be able to get it up shortly after with everybody's audio on there. I'm trusting these guys are checking out on their end why their video isn't coming through. I'm sure it's on my end though. It worked last week. Philip Martin was with us last week. I'm sure he could have fixed this. Terry,
Philip sabotaged me is what he did.
That's what it is.
Philip did something to stop all this from working.
Yeah. Anyway, apologies to everyone out there who's bearing with us here. We're trying to get this worked out. In the meantime, Zeke, why don't you share a story with us? And try not to take any shots at Joseph because we've Terry's taking care of that.
Well, this goes along kind of with the word that maybe we'll be talking about later. The word that I was thinking about was wrestle. And of course it comes from Jacob's interaction with that man who he encountered as he was making his way back home. And when I think about that story, we want to look into the metaphysical parts of it. It's mystical to us. It's kind of strange, and we wonder really what's going on. And I'm not going to say that I know exactly everything that's happening there, but I do think that it's maybe a snapshot of what we all go through. We wrestle, right? And sometimes God has to disable us in order to make us realize what his purpose for us is. The man that Jacob was wrestling, touched his thigh, and bam, his hip was put out of joint. He was crippled. I can't tell you how many times personally that God has had to wreck my plans so that I could see that he's got a better one, so that I could see that his way really is best. Peter tells us that we need to cast our cares on him because he cares for us, right? 1 Peter 5. And sometimes we do that. We come to God and we say, look, here's all my cares. Here's my trouble. We give it to him in a nice big bundle. And then later on we go back and we say, can I have that bundle back, please? You don't seem to be doing anything with it, right? When actually God is working things out in ways that we can't see. I don't know if that's what Jacob is having to learn when he wrestles with that man, but it's what my thoughts always come back to again and again and again when I read that little snapshot in chapter 32.
I'm glad. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, I think it's interesting that he asked for a blessing and he got an injury. Like, when you think about that, he ends up getting a blessing. The other thing about that story, it's amazing, Zeke, is that he just wants to know the name, and he's refused what he asked for, and yet in other places, people are given God's name, right? I mean, we see that done, and so a couple things you learn there is that sometimes you're injured on the way to your blessing, and you don't get what everybody else gets. I mean, that's a powerful story as well. There's a lot of things here, but you talked about how God works strangely and slowly in His own time, and I think this especially second half is really interesting about that. The idea that God is working. I used to think that all these guys, when I was a kid, look at these stories, all these guys were working to do God's plan. But when you grow up, what you learn is God's working His plan regardless of what these guys do. And that's the interesting thing to see. God's plans will be fulfilled regardless of what Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph do. God's going to work His plan. And I think that's one of the great things you see from all these stories.
I love the idea of wrestling with God, and the way that God presents this as a positive thing, because it might seem on the surface, Jacob's the guy that wrestles with God. That sounds like a bad thing, but at least in this context, it's not. And it's another one of those examples, by the way, where men and angels and God, the terms are used interchangeably. At least they seem to be used interchangeably. Clearly, in my mind, what's happening is that God is represented by an angel who is in the appearance of a man. This Jacob seems to realize there's more to it than just some stranger came up and picked a fight with him. He knows that this is a physical representation of his spiritual wrestlings, and he's determined to not let go of this. Like Zeke was saying before, there is a blessing here, and I may have to fight for it. I may have to wrestle long and hard with God. God may seem like the enemy on this, and He's not. It feels like He is, but at the end of it, no longer am I the supplanter. I'm the one who's trying to claim something that doesn't belong to me. I'm now the wrestler. I'm the one that finds the blessing, the one that is working hard, and God seeks that. God wants someone who acknowledges faith is hard, faith is work. It's not going to come easily to you, and you put in the effort, and God will find you there.
There may be a counterpart to Jacob and David. We had just got done studying 1 Samuel, and when the story finally turns to David and his trouble with Saul, you see David moving from one crisis to another, and the Psalms that he writes make you realize that he doesn't know why, right? The Psalms begin with, why is this happening to me? Why are you so far away from me, God? But by the end of the Psalm, he's stating his trust in God in spite of all the crazy stuff that's swirling around him. David was doing his own wrestling with God. I'm not trying to take us away from Genesis, but it just tells us that there's this underlying theme throughout all the characters that I think is even driven home to us in the 21st century. We do our own wondering, we do our own wrestling, when maybe if we just stopped fighting against him and started working more with him, things would go better for us.
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
How you mentioned the idea that it feels like we're wrestling with God, and there's a debate about whether that's God or not. But I think the point to point out is that Jacob thinks it's God, right? Because he says, I have seen God face to face after that encounter. So, we could debate about who it really is, but what we do know is we know who Jacob thought it was.
Right.
He felt like it was God. And I think we all feel that way at times in our life, that God is fighting against us. And one of the things I tell people from that story is sometimes you have to hold on to God in that struggle to get the blessing at the end. And that's what's most remarkable about Jacob, is that he doesn't let go, that he wrestles all night long. That's how much the blessing meant to him. And I think it's important to point out those good qualities of these guys. We highlight their bad stuff, but there's some really good things they do along the way. And that's why, as Zeke said at the very, very beginning, these guys are rascals. It gives me hope. You know, like me, there's good and bad and good and bad and good and bad, and God still uses them. In the end, they all seem to be formed and shaped. Like Joseph, I don't want to give him completely bad rap, because by the end he looks back and he goes, hey, God did all of this. I'll take care of you guys. I understand fully where I'm at now. It's there's this kind of realization at the end of the story that I think needs to be pointed out. And God did the same thing with Abraham, right? I mean, there's this up and down, up and down, up and down, and then you come to Mount Moriah, and it's like God says it's accounted to him for righteousness, what he does there. Which, by the way, how interesting is that tie-in, just to show this connectivity, that it's Abraham takes Isaac to Mount Moriah, is willing to offer his son, who's then spared, but he believes that even if he offers him, God can bring him back to life. And here the story of Joseph is that in kind of a realistic format for Jacob. This dead son is brought back to life for him, and he's reconnected to him. And I can't help but think about some of the connectivity to the idea of the prodigal son, although it's reversed. The father goes to the son instead of the son back home to the father, and all those kind of things. It's just amazing how Genesis sets the tone, I guess what I'm saying, for the entire Bible story, with all of these different aspects and things that you see woven in for the other 65 books that starts with this one. That's one of the cool things about the book.
You make a good point, Terry. You see a trajectory of growth with all these guys. Abraham at 100 is not Abraham at 75.
Yeah.
Jacob, when he goes back to Canaan after working for Laban, is not the same Jacob that left in haste. Even Joseph, when his brothers finally come to him, is not the same Joseph that was thrown into a pit. There's this constant growth and changing and metamorphosing of these characters. Again, it's a snapshot of what happens with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And gives us hope, right? I mean, and all the Bible characters are kind of that way, not just these guys, but these guys, again, kind of show that pattern. You see that in Peter, you see that in Paul, you see it, I mean, in everybody but Jesus, you see this pattern, because we're not Jesus. I mean, that's the thing. And it's really interesting, just I think, to see just all these different intricacies and things that seem to be, really bad character traits. And yet, like even with Joseph, there's things there, like I said, he goes off and he basically takes on the identity of an Egyptian priest to a degree. But there's still that moment where he says no to Potiphar's wife. And he even in that says, I can't sin against God in doing this. So there's, again, highlights and lowlights and all in between. But again, when you come to the end with these guys, they seem to have finally gotten it kind of dialed in, for lack of a better term. Even deeply flawed, broken men that God still uses. And I think that's the greatest thing I learned from this. I think Hal's trying to figure out some of the audio stuff. I sent him some messages, but the deeply flawed men, and the fact that we just have to realize that God is working in the background in ways we never understand. And I think that's one of the things that's really key. Like going back to what I said at the beginning, that this is a storyteller telling the story he wants to tell. And one of the things he wants us to see is how God is working in the background. And he highlights that. All of those statements that the Lord was with God, those are added in by the storyteller at the end of the story, right? Showing you in Joseph's story that whether Joseph knew God was with him or not, God was with him. And that all of these things happen because God is with Joseph. And I think that's just one of the amazing things to understand from that context.
Let's move on to the one verse. Is there one particular verse that jumps out at you? Zeke, you go first.
It's probably obvious. We've been talking about it, but it's 50:20. Genesis 50:20. Joseph said, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." That to me is the Bible story. God is working because his plan is to preserve many people alive, right? That's why did he say, in spite of the fact that he already knew that his own creation was going to turned dark almost as soon as they were created. Yet he said, let there be light. Even before he spoke those words, he knew what was going to happen, And as soon as he created his creation, his plan started rolling to bring them back to him, right? And we see that going on with not just in the story of Joseph's family, but why did he send Jesus? His own son, who was going to be turned against and brutalized, tortured, and then finally killed like a criminal. Why? To preserve many people alive. It reminds me of, I put that verse hand in hand with Romans 8:28, right? That tells us that God works his plan for those who were called according to his purpose, right? And we see that in Joseph, and in spite of our best intentions to go aside from that purpose from time to time, God is still going to work out his plan. God is faithful. What he says is going to happen no matter what. If he says I'm going to be blessed if I do if I do his will, then I'm going to be blessed if I do his will. If he says I'm going to suffer for going against him, I'm going to suffer for going against him. The whole thing is that God is working his plan regardless of what I do, and he's going to accomplish it no matter how I fight against it and try to thwart it by my own stubbornness. So I don't know, providence, I guess, is what I get out of that.
Absolutely. We want to be able to see with God's eyes. We want to hear God's plan. And sometimes God says, my plan is for you to do your job. You show up every day, do the work, take care today, take care of your family. I'll take care of the world. You don't worry about that. You just show up every day, whether it's in Potiphar's house or in the prison or at Bethel or facing Esau, whatever it happens to be. You do what you are expected to do, and I'll handle the big picture plans. Terry, you got a verse?
Yep. Well, I mean, as Zeke said, that's obviously the verse that everybody, I think, goes to for this section. I'll highlight a second one that kind of mentioned earlier, and that's this reunion scene between Joseph and Jacob, which is pretty interesting. It's interesting that Judah sent ahead to Joseph to let them know that he's coming, and Joseph goes out to meet his father. And if you look this is in Genesis 46, there about verse 29 and 30. It's really two verses. Joseph prepared his chariot, went up to meet Israel, his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I've seen your face and know that you're still alive. I see a lot of similarities, by the way, to the prodigal son in this. There in the prodigal son, the father goes out and meets the son, who no doubt is weary, coming from a famine back home. And it's interesting what you see here in this contrast is that God sends his nation away from home to a foreign land because of a famine where they can be preserved and renewed and restored and sent out to become a nation from this land. But then what we do is we throw that away in the picture of the prodigal son until we come home to be restored and renewed by the Father, because of our own spiritual choices that create a famine. And it's just interesting to kind of see that contrast in these two things. But this idea of, now that I've seen you, that you're alive, I can die. I think as a father, you can really identify, if you're a father, with that sentiment, by the way, that if you have a child who's dead or lost or missing, just that thought, to have this reunion and how beautiful that is. And the reason I connect that to the prodigal son is because for God, that's how beautiful that is when we come home. In the same sense that we've gone and we've created this rebellion and we come back home finally because of the spiritual famine that we create in our lives. He rushes out to meet us. He weeps on us and he celebrates that we are alive. My son who was dead is alive. You see so many similarities here in those two stories. And
you make a
Yeah, go ahead, Zeke.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Terry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I was just going to say we make a big deal out of Jacob and Joseph's reunion and Jacob's rejoicing. We see that in with Jesus with God in the story Jesus shares. That same celebration is there pictured.
Here's a side point that kind of goes along with that. We work hard to bring out application and to understand these stories more deeply. And it's important, I think, also to see the personal aspect of all of them. These are real events that occurred in the lives of real people. And
Yeah.
the scene of tenderness that you just pointed us to, like you said, what father hasn't felt that? What parent doesn't feel that when their own prodigal returns, when the one that they long for is somehow restored to them? That's real, genuine human stuff.
Mhm. And there's an
Yeah.
older brother story there too. The older brother is criticized in the parable of the prodigal son, and rightfully so, because of his attitude. Well, the older brothers of Joseph are criticized for their attitude, and there's some credit there too. But clearly, by the
Rightfully
end of
so.
this, by the end of the story, though, they have come around to the idea: look, it's not right that Dad treated us the way he did, and he treated Joseph the way that he did. But this is our father, and this is the way it is, and we're moving on. We're not gonna, and maybe we're partly to blame for this. Maybe we're a great deal to blame for the reason. Maybe Joseph was his favorite for a reason. Maybe we're a bunch of knuckleheads when we were growing up, and being able to forgive and move past this and accept family for who they are and what they are. That's just a tremendous lesson, I think.
Yeah.
All right, one word before we close off.
Well, you just said it. Forgiveness. The word isn't used in our in our uh, in all these 25 chapters. I don't think it is anyway. But the idea is there, especially it's hard to miss the power of forgiveness in Joseph's story with his brothers. But how many people would do that? I mean, I have a hard enough time sometimes trying to get past perceived offenses that someone has made against me. One person, how would I feel if my entire family ganged up on me and booted me out, left me for dead? Uh, that's why I say you get to a different kind of person uh, at the end of Joseph's story than he was when we began it. And it's because Joseph chose to forgive. And for me, that means the world. If I can choose to forgive, and that's a story throughout God's book. If I can choose to forgive, it may not do all that much for the person who I think has hurt me, but it's going to do a world for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Terry, you got a word for us?
Well, I think there's a bunch of words, but I think maybe what I'll go with is just faith, and from this standpoint, I guess, is that one of the things I see in this book is just the faith in God to work in the background in ways I will never understand. I mean, if you read the book of Genesis, I think it's a great example of what Isaiah 55 says, because when you read there in verses 8 and 9 that his ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts than our thoughts, you read this from an earthly perspective. None of this happens the way we think it should happen. Who would devise a plan to save a nation of people, or to create really a nation of people, by having a brother be obnoxious, who's thrown into a pit, sold for slavery, ends up in prison falsely accused of rape, and eventually, after being forgotten in prison for a couple of years, gets out to interpret dreams, is finally made second in command over the nation, and then can come and save his family. Like, that's not a Hallmark story at all. That's not how we think. But that's the way God used these characters to bring about the nation of Israel and ultimately to bring about the Messiah.
It's good. Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen. Thanks as always to Jerry Tesh and the fellows at Narrow Way for providing the music in our intro, assuming that worked properly today. Everything else didn't work. Check them out at www.narrowway.com. Be reading Exodus, the whole book, for next time, and check out my other podcast, Citizen of Heaven. If you like what you're hearing, like, share, and subscribe. Till then, this is Hal Hammons. We'll see you next week. read your Bible.